And that has something to do with the next speech of Mark van Vugt, La paradoja del macho guerrero, sobre la biología y la psicología del conflicto intergrupal.
The psychology of intergroups. He is a professor of evolutionary psychology, work in organizational psychology, Free University of Amsterdam. He's a research associate in the Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology, Oxford University, and cooperates with the University of Kent. He's studied cooperation and power in human groups. Amongst his many contributions to science, one that has had greater repercussions in the media, and which he's also going to talk to us today, is the hypothesis of the warrior male. And that is precisely the title, the paradox of the male warrior on the psychology and biology of international conflict.
This is your presentation.
Yes.
Right. Can everyone hear me? Is this okay? Yeah? All right. Before I start, and I gather I still have about 25 minutes or so? Yeah? Okay. I should make 2 points clear. One point is that I have no opinion whatsoever about Catalan succession or Spanish nationalism. I'm here to describe the science of intergroup relations and particularly the psychology of intergroup conflict. And the second point I'd like to make is that I disagree with the previous speaker in that I do think that we have, as humans, a tribal psychology, a psychology that has evolved to to deal with intergroup relations. And I particularly want to persuade you about the idea that there are that there are sex differences in our intergroup psychology. With that, I mean to say that men and women have evolved to respond differently to outgroup threats, and I'll present you some evidence for that. Okay, so the first part of my argument is that intergroup conflict is a common phenomenon in our species. When we look at organized intergroup conflict, we look at wars, and human history is littered with wars. And at any moment in time, there are many wars going on in the world that we don't even know of. We also have other forms of intergroup conflict, for example, in racial discrimination and violence against people of different ethnicities, in hooliganism, and of course also in terrorism as another example of a manifestation of intergroup conflict. Now, what is interesting from these examples is that this is not just the case with humans, but also with our primate cousins and also in our past. So this is a skull which depicts one of the first evidences of human violence. And this skull was found in a mass grave where a group of individuals, men, women, and children, were buried almost 40,000 years ago. And archaeologists can tell from the skeletons, particularly of this skull, that it has been violently attacked. And it's not a predator, so it has to be another male. So this is 40,000 years ago. But we can go even further, and then we see examples of intergroup violence happening between chimpanzees. And these are chimpanzees that patrol their borders. And when a lone individual of another group, a male, crosses the border, they'll form a coalition, a gang, that teams up against this lone individual, and if it's a male, they'll kill them sometimes. So the idea being here that they use what is called a balance of power. By killing the males of another group, they weaken that group so that the females will migrate from their group to the host group to make that bigger and stronger. So we have several pieces of evidence to indicate that intergroup behavior, in-group, out-groups, is part and parcel of human evolutionary history. But what is very interesting to consider is, in all the evidence, we are talking primarily about males, not females. And I want to make a clear distinction between male intergroup psychology and female intergroup psychology. And I'll present you some evidence for that difference. So they're all males. And so the question is, well, first the conclusion is humans are a tribal species. We already knew that, of course, but Charles Darwin has put it very eloquently. A tribe including many members who, from possessing in high degree the spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage and sympathy, who are always ready to aid one another and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, they would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection. So natural selection as playing out through competition between groups, essentially. So what can we then say about how this tribal psychology that is part of our nature, it comes very easily in humans, how has that evolved? Now we can rely on different kinds of theories, from evolutionary theory, evolutionary game theory, parental investment theory, and sexual selection theory. And they together point into the direction of a particular male intergroup psychology which is geared towards violence. So hence the headline when we published this research that the male sex drive is to blame for world's conflicts. That's not entirely true, but a little bit simplistic, but it gets the point. Okay, so what can we say about sex differences in intergroup psychology and how men and women negotiate their position vis-à-vis other groups? First, we have to establish that, as in all mammals, men and women pursue somewhat different mating strategies. There is an asymmetry in parental effort. Women, on the whole, females have to spend more time on caring, of course, pregnancy and then a long period of lactation, whereas men don't have to invest that biologically, so they spend more effort on mating, finding mates, sexual mates, essentially. And that, we argue, selects for somewhat different psychologies of men and women, whereas men are more interested in gathering multiple mates, multiple sexual partners. That fits a strategy of risk-taking, of bravery, but also of aggression, but also in some ways of, as Carsten de Dreux told, of cooperation and altruism. Interestingly, in his studies on oxytocin, he only used males as participants, and I would bet that if you use females, you wouldn't get the same effects. But that's up for empirical discussion. Okay, so men and women pursue different mating strategies. For men, it may be interesting to use aggression as a means to get their way, to get access to resources, mates, territories, etc. But what may be particularly interesting for males is to actually form coalitions with other males. And to do that, they have to resolve what is called a conflict of the prisoner's dilemma. And I've depicted that here on the right side of the screen. So you have James and Pete, who can form a coalition by fighting together, and then they each earn €2 or 2 women, partners, or resources, whatever. So they both get 2. But of course, it's interesting for Pete to let James do the fighting. And then Pete gets €3. He doesn't fight, but he gets the benefits of winning the war, for example. But James has to do the fighting, so he puts himself at risk. So he gets 0 payoffs. Now the equilibrium in the game is here. So normally a coalition is not being formed here. James and Pete will not fight together. But we see in humans and in some other animals as well that they do form these coalitions. So the question is, how does cooperation then come about between Pete and James so that they form a coalition? Now, going back to our prehistory, coalitions are part and parcel of human history. Nations are not. States are not. Communities are. Our psychology has evolved in small groups. So we can form large tribes and large nation states, but we have to, as it were, create symbolic identities to make people identify with these larger communities, because our natural inclination is to identify with somewhat smaller groups. Okay, so I have three hypotheses that emanate from this story, and they all lead to the suggestion that A, we have evolved a psychology that helps us in dealing with these intergroup encounters, and B, that there are sex differences in behavior towards in-groups and out-groups. Now, what are these differences? So the male warrior hypothesis, the female defense hypothesis, and the out-group male target hypothesis. Well, they make several predictions, and I'll present a little bit of research on each of them. What is the male warrior hypothesis? Well, first and foremost, if we look at the prevalence of males in combat, organized combats in war, then 99% of uniformed soldiers in combat are men. And we also see both in traditional societies like the Yanomami, the Mayenga, as well as in contemporary human societies, that brave male warriors actually do relatively well, in the sense they have a high risk of dying, but if they survive a battle, for example, they get rewards. So, for example, among the Yanomami, they get more offspring, and they have more sexual encounters. Sexual liaison. So it may have evolved as a profitable strategy to be a male warrior or a brave male warrior. So what does that predict then? That men's bias against outgroups is aggressive and competitive, and it is really aimed at dominating the other groups. Now, that may be very interested in the Spanish context, because I do not know whether men and women differ, for example, in the extent to which they want succession from Spain, or whether there are no gender differences. I would predict that there may be, but we can discuss that later. So what does that include, that male warrior psychology? It includes psychological mechanisms for forming these large-scale tribal coalitions, committing, having strong commitment to them, derogating outgroups, justifying intergroup aggression, and supporting tribal ideologies. Now, of course, these are predictions, and could we actually find some evidence for that? Well, first evidence comes from the laboratory, where we create these competitions between groups and then look at how men and women behave in these games. So what we find is that if we have groups competing with one another in the lab, then it's the men in these groups who identify more strongly with the group, who think more tribally, not the women so much. You could see that on the left side of the screen. And we also see that in the extent to which they contribute to the group. Men, when there is intergroup competition, the group's condition, they cooperate more with their in-group than women do. What about unprovoked attacks? That's also something that Carsten de Dreux talks about. Well, if you put people in war games in the lab, and you split them between the sexes, so you get, for example, females interacting with one another, that's on the left side, a female-female war competition. Then in the middle, the male-male war competition, and on the right side, a mixed competition where a male is pitted against a female. Now, interestingly, in these games, they do not know the gender of the partner or the opposition. They don't know them. But what you see is that in the male-male diets, they will make more unprovoked attacks in these war games by just attacking the other group in a sort of World of Warcraft, a sort of simulated video game. Now, this comes across all kinds of international surveys, and this is just one example. So this is from a ICM opinion poll, which was held in the US after the 9/11. So the question to the public was, do you support military action by the USA in retaliation for the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon? And you find a consistent sex difference between men and women. And this is not just one example, there are a host of international opinion. Men just find warfare and intergroup conflict or an intergroup aggression a more reasonable, justified response to an intergroup conflict. Stronger positive emotions associated with tribal conflict. This is also from a survey we conducted. War is bad or good, useless, useful. And also men have more strongly positive emotions associated with warfare and intergroup conflict. And then you have a more subtle way of showing this. So we have asked participants, what is your favorite color? Now, if you ask a Catalan what is their favorite color, it would be very interesting to ask what they come up with. It would even be more interesting to ask men, Catalan men, what is your favorite color, and Catalan women. Because maybe what you find is this difference. The men, when thinking about a favorite color, are more likely to come up with a tribal association. For example, blue, because it's the color of the American flag, and it's a color associated with our military. So that's an automatic association between something as meaningless as a color with a tribal categorization. Whereas women tend to use this much less likely. For example, orange is my favorite color. It's bright and cheerful. When I see stuff in orange, it makes me smile. There's no tribal connection there. So, and then, for example, in the context of which leaders you pick to represent you, then what you see is clear differences too, that if you ask people who you vote for your president when your country is at war, and you give them a choice between face, the above face or the below face, they pick the above face in war more. That's the blue one. Whereas the feminine face, the one below, is more preferred in the peacetime scenario. And again, we see that replicated in the real world when citizens choose their presidents or their representatives. When there is intergroup conflict, their perception of these leaders change. And they're much more likely to select for a more masculine male leader, dominant leader. And this, hence the quote, this is from an Israeli novelist, by always choosing warriors to lead us, perhaps we always doom ourselves to be in wars. So this is an interesting, I suppose, paradox, hence the male warrior paradox. We choose these masculine war leaders, but the only thing they do is it lead us to more wars. Okay, so this I'll skip. This is male warrior heroism. The only thing I should say about this is that indeed we find evidence that men who participate in intergroup conflict, whether it's gang violence, hooligans, or soldiers, they get more status within their group. And the status within their group makes them actually more attractive to women, which is an interesting dynamic, but yeah. So in some ways it's female choice that predicts these kinds of behaviors. Okay, let's go to the second hypothesis. What about women's tribal psychology? So women are less likely to form these aggressive coalitions to fight other groups. That's our hypothesis, prediction, and it's borne out by the data. But women's bias against outgroups is more driven by avoidance. And it has to do primarily with managing or keeping their sexual choice, their sexual options. So it's elevated the avoidance that women feel towards outgroup men under certain conditions. One is when the threats to their reproductive choice are most costly, so when they're most likely to get pregnant, or when vulnerability to sexual threats is greatest. Now, there's lots of stories, anecdotes, and also data about coercion and rape of women during warfare. And warfare seems to be an arena in which groups of men can basically get what they want without too much legislation, worry about repercussions, etc. And so one would expect that women would have a strategy to try and undermine that, for example, by avoiding outgroup men. Now, one of the studies that speaks to this is conducted in the US, where women, white women of university colleges, had to rate the attractiveness of different males. And you can see these males are different ethnicities. On the right side, you have a Caucasian, in the middle, a Chinese, Asian man, and on the left, a black man. So they had to rate these men in terms of their attractiveness. Now, what was interesting is that these women were followed during their menstrual cycle. And what these researchers found was that at peak fertility, so when women could actually get pregnant, and this is the increased line that you see in the middle, between the days of 10 and 15, which is the most fertile period of these women, their race bias was strongest, was greatest. So it seems that there is a biology influencing how women and men, we've seen from Karsten de Dreus, men, but here I focus on the women, how they respond to members of other groups. And the reason being is, that's our argument, that they should be quite avoidance-oriented towards outgroup men, particularly when they have a chance to become pregnant. That's the story. Then the third hypothesis is that we generally make a distinction between outgroup men and outgroup women. And we tend to be, as humans, much more careful, avoidant, and aggressive towards male outgroup members than female outgroup members. Something we also see in the chimpanzees. I've already explained that. So the hypothesis is that outgroup men will be the primary targets of intergroup bias. And some of these mechanisms would be avoiding these men more than we would women from outgroups, fearing them more, especially when we're under threat, and stereotyping and discriminating. And there is a wealth of evidence, particularly from the US, about the fate of black men and women. And on all kinds of criteria, when you look at, for example, aggression, but also how they're doing economically, female blacks, African Americans are actually doing much better on a number of these dimensions than African American males, economically, financially, in terms of education, etc. So it may be because this is a psychology that is focused on discriminating against outgroup men in particular. So what we did in this study, we had males do a stressful task. This is the ice bucket challenge, but they had to put their hand in cold water, which is quite can be quite painful, stressful. And then we had to them rate faces of either Arabs, you see that on the top, or on the bottom Caucasian men. And they had to rate them in terms of how trustworthy they gathered them to be. Now overall, they were relatively considered trustworthy, all the Arab faces and the Caucasian face, but there was a difference, particularly when people were put under stress. They had to have that hand in that ice bucket for a long time, so that's stressful. Then afterwards, when we showed them the pictures, they tended to find particularly the outgroup male faces less trustworthy. So threat and stress may be a precondition for intergroup bias, particularly towards males from the outgroup, not females. And there is another study that shows that. I'll forget about that. Okay, conclusions. Intergroup conflict is a significant selection force in human evolution, shaping a unique tribal psychology. This tribal psychology is gendered, and you should really look at men and women differently in how they deal with these intergroup conflicts. We have probably a male warrior psychology, a female defense psychology, and when we talk about outgroups and how we treat them, we're particularly discriminatory and perhaps avoidance and aggressive towards outgroup males, not so much females. What are the biological and neural mechanisms underlying that? Oxytocin is a candidate, testosterone is also a candidate, cortisol. Now it's very interesting that we've, in talking about intergroups, we talked about the particularly these violent intergroup conflicts, but of course groups pose different kinds of threats. So they pose indeed physical threats sometimes, but sometimes they also pose pathogen threats. Somebody talked about earlier about indeed a virus or an epidemic outgroups may also present literally pathogen threats sometimes. And so we have to be careful, or we probably have an evolved psychology to be careful about outgroup men and women because they may carry diseases. And finally, we're also careful about treating outgroup members because they may put a pressure on our economic resources. So what are the solutions? Given that we have an evolved tribal psychology, something that's part of human nature, we have to find ways to work with that or around it. And by working with that, I mean that we have to acknowledge that this exists, that we easily make, whenever there is a conflict, whether it's between Catalonia and the rest of Spain, or the West Bank, or Scottish Britain, we have to acknowledge that this is part of human nature. We have to acknowledge that. We have to also consider that it may be differences between how men and women deal with these threats. And we can work around it by making people, in some ways, more individual and more similar, by creating some sort of superordinate identity or by de-emphasizing individual differences. And that's my story. Thank you very much.